The following work is brought to you by ScriptCrib. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon for more information on our works. And as always, if you want to know more about what we're doing and be up to date when we release it, always like and subscribe. Elise opened her eyes and turned her head to the left, looking at the window to see the sun peering into the bedroom. The mattress she was on was very comfortable, something she was not accustomed to. The bed she slept on the Isle of Warton was a bit more firm. This one was soft and meant for a god. To her right, the god of chaos was laying. She had not intended to bed the god of chaos, but as the night went on, she allowed herself to give in to her inhibitions. Though many in her case would feel remorse for what she had done, Elise did not. Throughout her evening with Malorus, she felt an odd connection with him. She felt as if she had known him for years. She felt comfortable with him. She felt as if he had her best interest at hand. And while he was not a member of the Isle of Warton, he mentioned several times how he would be willing to help, so long as the conditions were correct. He didn't want to wage war with Xylene or another one of the gods. However, he was willing to do what he needed to do to keep Elise and her family safe. "Good morning," moaned Malorus as he rolled over onto his back. He shifted his gaze over to Elise and smiled. "I apologize if I came on to you too far, but your radiance and the alcohol was far too much for me to ignore. This is something I've never done before." Upon hearing that, Elise laughed loudly. "You're telling me you've never went to bed with one of your followers, or at least another human?" Malorus nodded emphatically. "I've never been to bed with a human. The last time I experienced the touch of a woman was on Tangresia, and I must say, the wait was worth it." Elise Mertrand immediately rolled her eyes and moved over to the other side of the bed. "I don't know if I can believe you, Malorus. As charming as you are, I'm sure you've been to bed with many of your followers. The touch of mortals must be something you're very familiar with." Malorus sat up and appeared defensive to Elise's words. "I promise you, Elise, I've never experienced the touch of a woman on Dunai. You were my first here, and as I said, I'm very thankful. It was very well worth the wait." Elise smirked and rolled her eyes again. "Then I'm glad I could be a good first for you, though I still find it very hard to believe." She paused and caught her breath while looking up at the ceiling. "I do wonder what Evolus will think of this when he finds out." Malorus chuckled while throwing his legs outside of the bed and putting his feet on the floor. "Do you tell your brother everything?" Elise nodded emphatically. "I have a tendency to tell him absolutely everything. We're very close, something that my father wanted. When my mother passed away, my brother was there for me. My father was distant, but Evolus and I had a bond, something that I wish I could share with others. I mean, Malorus, don't you have a bond with your brothers?" Malorus laughed maniacally as he rose to his feet and walked away. "My brothers have tried to have me killed on multiple occasions. I even tried to kill one of my brothers, hence why I ended up out of Tangresia and here on Dunai. I've only heard legends of how you all ended up on Dunai. If you don't mind me asking, how did you end up here?" Malorus kept his back to Elise as he walked over to a basin. He cupped his hands and poured water on his face, allowing the remnants to drip back down into the basin. "I don't like to get too far into it, but why don't I just say that Darian, Dorilius, and myself tried to assassinate my brother to usurp the throne. Our father didn't think too highly of it and had us exiled into the void, where we decided to form our own realm." Elise nodded and rose to her feet. "And I suppose here you are now then," she said with a blustery tone. Malorus turned and looked back at Elise with a smile. "And here we are now," he said confidently and calmly. "I know there's open conflict with some of my other gods, some of these other celestial beings that came from Tangresia, but if I had to think about it and do it all over again, I don't think I would. I don't think I would change a thing. I know Xylene is a bastard, and I know Talgis is unpredictable. I know Nerilil is emotional and Saria is calculating, but if I had to go back and do it again, I wouldn't change a thing. Dunai is perfect. It's volatile and it's chaotic, and I absolutely love it. It's what I wish Tangresia could have been. It's what I wish we could have done on that master realm. Getting kicked out of that realm was the best thing that ever happened to me, and while Dorilius and Darian may disagree, I can only attest that I am very happy with how things turned out. I'm happy in Dunai." Elise walked over to the window and looked out at the crowd in Bryle. The merchants were all peddling their goods, and the citizens were all moving about toward the harbor. She glanced over her shoulder at the god of chaos and smiled. "I didn't ask about that," she said with a warm, inviting tone. "I guess there's something about me, Malorus, that makes you feel comfortable, that makes you feel like you can talk. Maybe there's more things you want to get off your godly chest. Perhaps you want to talk about the Duchies of Ornay and how they can stop attacking the Isle of Warton. Perhaps you can talk to me about how we can stop them from being vultures circling for our carcasses." Malorus reached over to the side of the basin and grabbed his clothes. He slipped them on and turned back to look at Elise. "I will be happy to take care of the Duchies of Ornay. They will leave the Isle of Warton alone. I don't need anything in return. All I need is a little bit of preferential treatment for trade routes. We don't need the Isle of Warton for us. We don't need them to be aligned with Bryle. We don't really need them for trade preference. But I need to at least say I got something out of this if any of the local magistrate asks. I am a god, but I still like to save face with some of the others. I do hope you understand." Elise chuckled softly before stepping through the room, walking toward the god of chaos as he stood near the basin. She moved elegantly along the wooden floor, eventually reaching the god of chaos and standing in front of him. She placed her hands on his shoulders and leaned in, placing her lips on his. The kiss was warm and long, but very meaningful. Once it was finished, Malorus looked into Elise's eyes. "Why don't we talk about you staying here? Why don't we talk about you leaving the Isle of Warton and staying in Bryle with me at my side?" Elise was taken aback by how straightforward Malorus was. He didn't waste any time talking to her about courting her, but upon hearing it come out of his lips, she knew it was just. She knew he meant it. She knew that the god of chaos was smitten. Elise was speechless. She didn't know how to respond. She stared into Malorus's eyes and nodded slowly, hoping to convey her message without having to move her lips. She was confused and didn't know how it would work. She was immortal and he was not. He could live forever and eventually she would find her way to the scales. She didn't know what to do or how to do this. She didn't know what rules would have to be applied. However, in a stroke of kismet, a large sword came through the ceiling and landed on the floor. Upon hearing the impact, Malorus laughed maniacally. Elise was confused, but Malorus knew what was at play. "I knew it wouldn't take her long to get here." Malorus chimed in as he turned away from Elise and looked over at the goddess of law emerging. Vessia walked forward and grabbed the hilt of her sword, pulling it out of the wooden floor and placing it in the holster. Her dark skin was elegant and beautiful. Her hair, dark and hanging down to the center of her back, reflected the sun that was coming in through the windows. Her armor was white, gold and silver, and on her back, a spear was positioned right in the middle. Her eyes were innocent, but her gaze knew only judgment. She was the goddess of law, the celestial being tasked with maintaining the law of Dunai. And upon seeing Malorus standing next to Elise, Vessia hung her head and sighed. "And what mess are you creating for me now, Malorus?" she asked rhetorically as the disdain came off of her lips. She was annoyed with Malorus, but she understood where he was coming from. He loved his people and he loved humanity, unlike the rest of the gods. She knew it was only a matter of time before Malorus found his way into the bed of a woman, and now, here it was, creating much of a headache for her. Vessia was remarkably annoyed. Since the inception of Dunai, she had always managed to keep her nose clean and stay out of many of the affairs of the other gods. However, Malorus falling in love with a human after one night with her was something that made her have to take action. She had to show up in his bedchambers to confront him about it. She had to find out more. As much as it turned her stomach and caused a great sense of nausea, Vessia had to take action, and the first thing that happened would be finding out more information. She needed to know if Malorus actually had feelings for this human, or if this was simply some passing fling. After several minutes of Malorus defending his actions and Elise standing to the side, unable to speak because she didn't know what to say, Vessia had heard enough. "Malorus, you're an absolute fool," she exclaimed as she turned around and looked toward the window. "She is a princess of the Isle of Warton, a sovereign nation who is under constant threat of Xylene and his Naga, and here you are going to bed with the princess. Malorus, you have had some terrible ideas in the history of Dunai, but this one is probably the worst," exclaimed Vessia with disdain. Malorus stood there and took the tongue lashing from Vessia. She was probably correct in that he had had worse ideas. However, he had feelings for Elise and he was willing to fight for it. He was willing to stand up to the goddess of law and explain himself. "Vessia, my feelings are my feelings and that's all that matters. They are my feelings. You don't have to have a say in that." Vessia groaned loudly in disgust. "But if you wish to act on them, I do," exclaimed Vessia harshly. "The rules and laws have been in place since the inception of Dunai. In order for her to become immortal and to stay by your side, she has to become God-touched, and I cannot allow her to become a God-touched servant of Malorus. I can't allow her to be your bride as well as your servant. That does not work for me. That does not work for Dunai." Malorus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then what do you propose, goddess of law? What do you propose our options are? I will not simply stand back and let her succumb to your scales. What options do you propose? Vesia remained stoic momentarily as Malorus continued to muse. It is my decision who my god-touched servants are, Vesia. Those are the rules that we set forth. You cannot dictate who can and cannot become a god-touched servant. When we set forth the rules, we made sure to establish that you had no hand in that. You could establish the rules of the god-touched, but you could not choose who we could have as servants. If I want Elise to be my god-touched servant and my bride, that is my business. That is not yours. All you can do is enforce the rules. All you can do is enforce your petty laws. Vesia continued to look at Malorus with a stoic gaze. Her expression was untouched, and her appearance was unfazed. The silence was palpable as Elise remained in the corner. She took a step forward, trying to appear large, trying to appear confident. Excuse me, Vesia. Perhaps there's something else we can discuss. Perhaps there's another way around this. Vesia turned to Elise and scoffed. And what would you suggest, mortal, that we have not already thought of? We have lived countless numbers of lives compared to you. What knowledge and wisdom do you possess that we do not? What advice could you give us? Malorus took a step forward and huffed loudly. You will not talk to her like that, Vesia, not in my chambers. And as far as I am concerned, you will not talk to any of my followers like that while you are in Dunai. Vesia turned and looked at Malorus with disgust. And you will address me as the goddess of law, Malorus. Elise took another step forward. I just noticed that the tension between the two of you is growing, and we will not reach a conclusion or a settlement until we calm down. Now please, can we discuss this as gentlemen and gentle ladies? As the words slipped off Elise's mouth, the doors to Malorus's chambers opened. Bright light was coming in from the windows as Ebolus and Gervania appeared. Upon seeing the goddess of law, Gervania's eyes opened and her mouth dropped. Add this to something I wasn't expecting to see today, she said in jest as she glanced over at Ebolus. We're in the presence of two gods, not just one. Ebolus looked forward at Vesia, confused at who she was. And who is this? He asked curiously. Gervania took her elbow and drove it into his ribs. That's the goddess of law. Show some respect. Ebolus grabbed his ribs and rubbed them slightly. Oh, I apologize. I've never seen any busts or depictions of her. My apologies, Vesia, he said with a wry grin. There are not many busts or statues on Dunai of me, so I can forgive this misstep, she said softly. Good morning, brother, announced Elise as she looked at Ebolus. Sister, he replied softly. Elise turned away from Ebolus and looked back at Vesia. As I was saying, perhaps there is something we can discuss. Perhaps there is a compromise. Perhaps there is something that we can do that will allow me to live with Malorus, to be his bride, and to be his servant. Vesia shook her head emphatically, followed by Ebolus scoffing loudly. You want to do what? Inquired Ebolus rudely. You want to be his bride? You just met the man. Malorus laughed loudly with Gervania hanging her head. Some women act fast, Ebolus, quipped Gervania with a wry grin. But not my sister, countered Ebolus. She is thoughtful, methodical, and doesn't make many decisions under duress. One night with the god of chaos and she's already in bed with him. What gives? How did this happen? Vesia stepped forward and raised her hand. How she ended up in his bed is beyond you. What you need to worry about is why you're here in front of me. God-touched, why are you here? Why are you in the chambers of the god of chaos when you serve the god of the forge? I'm sure Valkas has many questions to why you're here. Gervania looked at Vesia and nodded. He knows that I am here. I have not hidden anything from him, she said firmly. Vesia, I have the right to change my allegiance one time, and I've come to parley with Malorus to discuss changing my allegiance to him. His values align with mine. He and I possess the same love and affection for humanity. It's something I appreciate about him, and a reason why I would like to serve him. Malorus turned toward Gervania and nodded. Then that's all I need to hear. Gervania, was it? You are welcome to join my ranks. Gervania tilted her head slightly. Is that it? All I had to do was say that? She inquired passively. Malorus nodded. There's far too many things on my plate right now in this chamber for me to discuss how you can become my god-touched servant. So long as you have a love for humanity and are willing to serve me, that's good enough for now. We can discuss the rest of it later. Right now, we're trying to figure out how Elise here can become my bride, and if you happen to have any ideas, now would be the time to bring them forward. The room fell silent once more. Elise stood in the center, trapped between the gaze of Vesia, Malorus, and her brother, Ebolus. Gervania was off to the side, somewhat ignored, while also wondering how she could please Malorus. This was her opportunity to show how useful she could be. In a brief moment of brilliance, she spoke up. Vesia, what if Elise became your god-touched? Malorus's eyes widened and his jaw dropped, with Vessia being taken aback by the suggestion. You want her to become my god touched? I have none, Vessia said sharply. Dravania stepped forward and opened up her hands. I'm very aware of this, goddess of law. However, this would satisfy all the requirements. She would become immortal and could live by Malorus's side without being his servant. She would be your god touched and your servant. However, she could stay with Malorus. It's the best of both worlds. Everybody gets what they want in the end, and no one has to make a sacrifice. You get a servant, which you may or may not want. Malorus gets his bride, and Elise gets to live with Malorus. It's a solution that solves everything. Evelyn stepped forward and turned toward Dravania. No, it doesn't. My sister is still going to be married to the god of chaos. This does not solve everything, he said sharply. Dravania tried to bring about a sense of calm with Evelyn. I know this isn't good for you, and it may not be good for your kingdom, but it is good for your sister, and you need to realize that perhaps this is what she wants. Dravania paused and locked eyes with Evelyn. At some point, we have to do what is best for us. We can't think about the gods. We can't think about our families. We cannot think about our kingdoms. Just like what I had to do by leaving Valkus and joining Malorus. There comes a point where we have to do what is best for us. Evelyn remained silent as he felt the eyes of judgment on him. He shifted away from Dravania and saw the goddess of law staring at him. As soon as their eyes met, Vessia let out a brief laugh. I'll consider your proposal, Dravania, but first I need to talk to her brother. The room was taken aback by Vessia's remarks, including Evelyn. Excuse me, goddess? Questioned Evelyn. Vessia walked toward Evelyn and passed him toward the door. Come, we'll talk in the hallway, or perhaps we can talk on the veranda. Would that be acceptable, Malorus? Asked Vessia rhetorically as she looked over her shoulder, not caring what his response was going to be. She was going to have a conversation with Evelyn whether Malorus approved it or not. However, Malorus nodded and agreed. Evelyn, knowing he had little to do to stop the goddess of law, obliged. He turned and followed her out of the room, leaving Dravania, Elise, and Malorus alone. The two doors closed, and they made their way through a hallway, on their way out to a veranda where they would look out on the city of Bryle and the ocean as several large boats filled with merchants unloaded goods into the city. Vessia sighed heavily as she wrapped her hands around a handrail. She looked out at the city of Bryle and took in the sights. It's not often I get a chance to look out at humanity. It's not often I get to look out at our creation. I typically have to stay in my realm and judge the souls of Dunai. I don't get a chance to look at them as they live. I only get a chance to look at it once it's finished. Evelyn walked up and stood beside Vessia, not knowing what to do. It was a very awkward moment for him, as he had never really had a conversation with a god before. He had spoken with Malorus earlier, but he wasn't prepared to speak with the goddess of law. Humanity's a fickle thing, inserted Evelyn, trying to fill the awkward void between them. Vessia turned her head away from the port and looked at Evelyn. What do you mean? She asked. Evelyn wasn't expecting Vessia to question him. However, he took a moment to compose himself so they could give her an answer that was not nonsensical. Goddess, if you look out there at the port, you can see that most of these people are good. They may or may not be followers of a god. They may or may not follow the rules of the laws of Dunai. However, most of them are all out for survival. Most of them are out to help their families. Most of them are out to try and help themselves. While there may be some people in this realm who are somewhat evil, most everyone here is good. At least almost. And if I'm being fair, it's when the gods get involved that people start to turn bad. If the gods were not here, if the gods were not involved, Dunai would be a mostly peaceful place. I mean, yes, kingdoms would wage war with one another because power and greed still fuel us. However, most people are good, and while humanity is a fickle thing, the bulk of us just want to survive. The bulk of us just want to live productive lives. And the bulk of us just want peace. Vessia smiled and nodded, understanding where Evelyn was coming from. Is that what you want on the Isle of Warton? She asked curiously. That is most definitely what I want, goddess. I want the people of my island to be at peace. I want my father to be able to rule, and I want to be able to stand by his side. If I could be honest, I want that for all of Dunai. I want all of Dunai to be at peace. I'm tired of having to fight the Naga of Xylene. I'm tired of having to worry about the Duchies of Ornay. I want Dunai to be at peace. Vessia smiled and turned back toward the port. While you were talking to Dravania, I was taking a moment to look into your soul. I was looking into your essence to see just who you were, Evelyn. And I can tell that's what you really want. I can tell you're the type of person who really wants peace. Vessia paused as Evelyn took a moment to look out at the horizon. Evelyn, I want to offer you something. Something I've never offered anyone before. I know this is short notice, and I know you haven't had time to think, but you'll have to give me an answer right now. I'm open to allowing Elise to become my God-touch servant, so that she can marry Malorus and be by his side for all of eternity. However, there's something else that I want in return. I have no God-touch servants. I have priests, I have some followers, but I have no God-touch servants. I've made it a point not to have any, because I know the moment I have one, I'm going to be challenged. I know that Xylene, Talgus, and some of the others will try and fight the God-touch servant that I create. With that being said, Eblis, if I am to make Elise my God-touch servant, I will need a second God-touch servant to take care of her. Vesia paused as Eblis pondered what she was preparing to offer. Eblis Mertrand, I know you want to protect the Isle of Warton. I've seen in your heart, and I know it truly yearns for peace. The God-touch servants on Dunai are getting out of control. They're getting far too many of them, and while some of them, like you said, are good, there are some that stand for evil and that need to be dealt with. Eblis, I need a champion. I need someone to stand up to the other God-touched on this realm and to protect your sister. Would you become my champion? Would you become my right hand? Would you stand up for Dunai and ensure that humanity will have a peaceful existence for the rest of eternity? Eblis stood in silence. His eyes were wide and his jaw was closed. However, without saying a word, he nodded slowly. His eyes were confident, and he knew what he had to do. By becoming Vesia's God-touch servant, the Isle of Warton would be safe. His sister would be able to marry Malorus, something that he still was uncomfortable with, but it was what she wanted. Eblis would become immortal, Eblis would become the servant of Vesia, but the Isle of Warton would be safe, and his sister would be happy. Then let's go tell your sister, Eblis, and let's go tell Malorus that I'm about to have 2 God-touch servants for the first time in the history of Dunai.